After Hulk Hogan died, the wrestling world fell silent. Then The Undertaker, a man who shared more than 3 decades of history with him, finally spoke.
So I remember getting there about noon.
But what he revealed about Hulk Hogan's funeral and what really happened behind the scenes painted a very different picture from what fans were told. Let me break it down. The Golden Goose was gone on the morning of July 24th, 2025. Emergency responders from the Clearwater Fire Department and Police Department were dispatched at 9:51 a.m. after a 911 call reported cardiac arrest. Paramedics worked on Hogan at the scene for 30 minutes before transporting him by ambulance to Morton Plant Hospital. He never came back. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. Terry Jean Bolio was 71 years old. The Pinellas County Forensic Science Center ruled the cause of death as acute myocardial infarction, a heart attack listed as a natural manner of death. Medical records noted a history of atrial fibrillation and chronic lymphocytic leukemia as contributing factors. He had also undergone a 4-level anterior cervical discectomy and fusion on May 14, 2025, roughly 10 weeks before he died. That surgery was the latest in a long line. Hogan had reportedly undergone around 25 surgical procedures over the previous decade, the accumulated toll of a career that had put extraordinary wear on a human body long before that body was ready to stop. In the weeks before he died, insiders described Hogan dealing with shortness of breath, fatigue, weight loss, and oxygen use. Earlier that same month, rumor surfaced that he was on his deathbed or in a coma. His wife, Sky Daly, and his representatives firmly denied those reports at the time, saying he was recovering and active. When the death was confirmed, those denials became one more piece of the complicated picture people were assembling around his final weeks. What was not complicated was the scale of the reaction. When the news broke, it hit the wrestling industry like a structural collapse. Hogan was not simply a popular wrestler. He was the engine of a cultural shift, the man who, through his 1984 WWF Championship win over the Iron Sheik, the inaugural WrestleMania, and a run of mainstream crossovers that most wrestlers never approach, helped take professional wrestling from regional entertainment to a global, multi-billion-dollar industry. WWE's official statement noted that he helped achieve global recognition for the company in the 1980s and called him one of pop culture's most recognizable figures. That was not press release exaggeration. It was documented fact. Triple H described Hogan as the archetype of what it meant to be a superstar, saying WWE would not be where it is today without him. Vince McMahon called him the greatest WWE superstar of all time and a trailblazer who transformed wrestling stardom into a global phenomenon. Ric Flair, a man who had been Hogan's opponent, tag partner, and friend across multiple decades, said he was absolutely shocked and that nobody would ever compare. Jerry Lawler said plainly that wrestling would not be what it is today without Hulk Hogan and that he was the most important figure the business had ever produced. Sylvester Stallone, who worked with Hogan on Rocky III, released a statement. Donald Trump released a statement. John Cena, Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Kurt Angle, Sting, and Jimmy Hart followed. The responses kept coming for hours without slowing down. Then, at around 6:12 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time that same day, Mark Calloway posted on both X and Instagram. He included 2 photographs and wrote, "The wrestling world has lost a true legend. His contributions to our business are immeasurable, and for that, I am appreciative. Thank you, Hulk Hogan." The post reached more than 115,000 likes and millions of views within hours. 11 words formed the core of the tribute. Contributions, business, appreciative. Thank you. No warmth beyond what was documented. No distance beyond what was honest. Every word in that post came from 34 years of direct experience with this specific man, and if you knew the story between them, if you knew what happened in Detroit in 1991, if you knew about the conversation in San Antonio 6 days later, if you knew what Calloway had said on his own podcast every time the subject came up, you could feel the weight of every word that was chosen and every word that was left out. This tribute was not coming from a friend. It was coming from someone who had spent 3 decades navigating a complicated professional relationship with a man whose contributions to wrestling were undeniable and whose conduct inside that same industry was, by Calloway's own account, something else entirely. The tribute was honest. It just required context to understand WHY'd in the weeks that followed. The Undertaker went further on his podcast, 6 Feet Under. He addressed the reactions to Hogan's death, and then he started opening up about what really happened at the funeral. The funeral and the fractures. A private funeral service was held around August 5, 2025, at Indian Rocks Baptist Church in Clearwater, Florida, the same church where Hogan had been baptized alongside his wife, Sky Daly, in 2023. That baptism had been a public moment for Hogan, a statement about faith and late-life renewal that he discussed openly. The choice of that church for his funeral carried weight. By design, it was meant to be a quiet, private farewell. What surrounded it was anything but quiet. Brooke Hogan, his daughter, did not attend the service. Instead, she held her own private beach tribute, explaining that her father hated the morbidity of funerals and that this was her personal way of saying goodbye. It was a statement that communicated several things at once: her grief, her understanding of what her father would have wanted, and the unmistakable distance between herself and the people who organized the official service. She positioned herself outside the formal structure of the farewell, just as she had positioned herself outside the formal structure of the estate. Brooke had reportedly requested removal from her father's will years earlier, not out of hostility, she explained, but to avoid the kind of conflict that was now unfolding anyway. The irony of that decision was difficult to miss. The conflict she tried to prevent was happening in full view, only now it was unfolding without her name on the document and without her presence in the pews. She was still receiving a separate life insurance payout, but her deliberate absence from the will had not insulated her from the emotional chaos surrounding Hogan's death. It had simply removed her from one legal front while the others burned. Linda Hogan, Hogan's ex-wife of more than 2 decades and the mother of both Brooke and Nick, also did not attend the funeral. Her public statements afterward referenced past family trauma. Her absence, combined with Brooke's, meant that the two women who had been the central presences in Hogan's family for most of his adult life were both missing from his official farewell. The divorce from Linda in 2009 had been one of the messiest and most public separations in professional wrestling history. A years-long tabloid saga that exposed the gap between the mythology of Hulkamania and the reality inside that family. That history did not disappear on July 24, 2025. It simply returned in the form of 2 empty seats. The person who was present, the person in control and making the decisions, was Sky Daly, Hogan's widow, whom he married in 2023 after a relationship that developed during some of the hardest years of his later life. Sky had publicly denied the coma rumors in July. She confirmed that cremation was Hogan's documented wish when questions arose about the circumstances of his death, and she became the central point of contact for every decision about how he would be memorialized and how the estate would move forward legally. There was even a brief public dispute over burial attire, whether Hogan should be laid to rest in a suit or in wrestling gear. By the standards of what was building underneath it, it was a small-scale argument. Brooke also raised questions about the official cause of death and reportedly offered to fund an independent autopsy in the days immediately following the announcement. For a moment, the planned cremation was put on hold. Sky confirmed again that cremation had been Hogan's stated wish. Police found no evidence of foul play, and the process moved forward. But the fact that Hogan's own daughter felt the need to offer money for an independent verification of how her father died, within days of the announcement, said something concrete about the trust dynamics inside that family at the time of his death. The public mourning was far from unified. Hogan's family publicly requested that his past scandals not be brought up in the aftermath of his passing. The internet did not comply. The 2015 Gawker tape, the leaked sex recording, the racial comments captured in that footage, and the years of fallout that stripped him of his Hall of Fame placement and WWE contract all resurfaced within hours of the announcement. Segments of the Black wrestling community spoke publicly about the painful contradiction of being asked to mourn someone whose most infamous private recording contained some of the most offensive language imaginable. The divide was real. It was loud. And it cut directly through the wrestling industry's collective attempt to grieve. The story of Hogan's funeral was not a single moment at a single church on a single day. It was a weeks-long unraveling of grief, financial conflict, family estrangement, legal maneuvering, and unanswered medical questions. The man who built an entire career on controlling how he was perceived could not control his own family's attendance at his funeral. He could not stop his daughter from going to a beach instead. He could not prevent his estate from becoming a battleground. He could not stop Brooke from raising autopsy questions, keep the 2015 tape from resurfacing, or prevent the malpractice probe from becoming headline news by October. The Undertaker watched all of this from the outside, not from inside the family circle because he was never truly part of it in any personal sense, but from the perspective of 34 years of accumulated knowledge about who Hogan was and how he operated. And the podcast episode that finally put his full response on public record was about to become one of the most referenced pieces of audio in the entire conversation surrounding Hogan's legacy. By the time Mark Calloway recorded the 6 Feet Under episode addressing Hogan's death directly, the wrestling world had already split into 2 irreconcilable camps. One side mourned him, arguing, with genuine conviction, that his contributions to the industry outweighed any individual controversy. The other side treated his death as an opportunity to dismantle the mythology entirely, revisiting the racism tape, backstage politics, union-busting accusations, and decades of stories from wrestlers who believed they had been damaged by Hogan's influence. The discourse was loud, polarized, and largely uninterested in nuance. Calloway stepped directly into the middle of it and said what he believed. He defended Hogan's legacy in clear, unambiguous terms. He criticized those who used the moment of Hogan's death to attack him. He refused to pile on at the same time. He maintained a line between who Hogan was backstage, something Calloway had discussed openly for years, and what Hogan built for the industry as a performer. To him, those were 2 separate truths that could coexist, and to fully understand the weight of what Calloway said in that podcast episode, you have to remember what he had already said publicly months before Hogan died, when the Netflix premiere of WWE Raw unexpectedly became a referendum on how modern wrestling audiences viewed Hulk Hogan. The Raw Netflix premiere was one of the highest-profile presentations WWE had staged in years. Hogan appeared to promote a beer brand he was involved with, and the crowd reaction was not ambiguous. They booed him, not politely, not quietly, loudly, and with the unmistakable clarity of an audience that had collectively made up its mind. Calloway was there. He watched every second of it from inside the building, and when his podcast co-host asked whether he felt bad for Hogan, his response came immediately, without hesitation and without hedging.
Well, hey man, I got feelings. I got feelings for people. Like, sometimes in life, things come back.
Sometimes in life, things come back around. For anyone carrying the history of 1991, the early arrival in Detroit, the shower conversation, the constant reminders about the neck throughout the day, the paramedics, the office floor, and the explanation in San Antonio that never quite held together. Those 5 words were not philosophical. They were precise and personal. Mark Calloway delivered them in the calm, measured tone he uses when he wants something to land without overstating it. He was not surprised by the boos. He was not emotional about them. He understood exactly what they represented. What followed on the podcast was a clear-eyed explanation of why the crowd reacted the way it did.
And then obviously, you know, he gets caught on tape, you know, saying some derogatory racist things. And, you know, in this day and age where all of that is such a hot button deal, like I don't know what you expect.
Fans had full access now. Every podcast, every book, every first-hand account from wrestlers who had been inside that locker room and described, often in detail and without restraint, what it was like to be on the receiving end of Hulk Hogan's political maneuvering, the kayfabe wall between what happened backstage and what the audience believed had been dismantled by the internet, by the podcast era, and by the transparency that came from retired wrestlers who no longer had any reason to protect. The mythology, the boos at the Netflix premiere were the product of that access, and Mark Calloway saw it clearly. That quality of measured, durable honesty is what made his words carry weight in a conversation where most people had already chosen a side and were defending it loudly. And it is that same quality that becomes essential context when you look at what came next. The Ric Flair claim, the Netflix documentary, and the full shape of what Undertaker actually revealed about Hulk Hogan's final chapter. All the bodies are buried. The wrestling community had barely finished processing the initial wave of tributes, denials, and controversy from July when it was hit with another layer entirely: claims that the man who died of a documented heart attack may have been pushed toward a destructive alternative because of a healthcare situation already tied to a family-initiated malpractice probe. The timing of the claim, landing directly on top of the ongoing legal investigation, made it impossible to separate from the broader question of what had really happened to Hogan's health in the weeks between his May surgery and his July death. Sky Daily responded in December 2025, calling the claim untrue and saying plainly that Flair was misinformed. Flair later walked back or clarified parts of his comments, but the damage had already been done. The man who had delivered one of the most emotional tributes on the day of Hogan's death, saying he was absolutely shocked and that nobody would ever compare, was now being publicly contradicted by Hogan's widow over the circumstances surrounding his final days. The fracture between Flair and Hogan's inner circle became a headline on its own, adding yet another disputed thread to a death that had already been examined, argued over, and relitigated from every possible angle since the moment the news broke. Then came the Netflix documentary, arriving like the final act of a story that had been building for decades. Hulk Hogan, Real American, a 4-part documentary series, premiered on Netflix on April 22, 2026. It had reportedly been filmed before Hogan's death across more than 20 hours of interviews. It was Hogan's final extended statement on his own life, his career highs, his Hollywood years, the 2015 racism scandal, and everything in between. It was designed to be the definitive version of the Hulk Hogan story, told by the man himself before anyone else could tell it for him. The trailer contained one moment that stopped every conversation about his legacy in its tracks. Hogan looked directly into the camera with the timing of a man who had spent 50 years understanding exactly what would land and said, "You want me to tell the truth? Okay. I know where all the bodies are buried." The line did exactly what it was built to do. It made people keep watching. It made them speculate. It made them start constructing lists. Which bodies? Buried by whom? About what? The 2015 racism tape, the backstage politics, the union discussions, the 1991 Survivor Series, the decades of relationships that ended badly, quietly, or with no public explanation at all. Nobody knew, and that was the point. It was the classic Hulk Hogan move in its purest form. Find the thing that keeps the audience locked in, then deliver it in a way that closes no doors while opening every possible question. But this is where the months of public comments from The Undertaker begin to matter even more. Because to understand why his words carried so much weight, and why his account of those years stood apart, you have to go back to where everything started between him and Hulk Hogan. Detroit, 1991. The night it began, in the professional wrestling business of 1991, there was one rule above all others. You did not hurt Hulk Hogan. Not in the ring. Not in a promo. Not in a backstage disagreement. And certainly not in front of Vince McMahon. Hogan had been the face of the WWF since 1984, the man who sold out Madison Square Garden, headlined the first 9 WrestleManias, appeared on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and helped turn professional wrestling from a regional attraction into a mainstream American spectacle. Inside that locker room, they called him the Golden Goose, and they meant it. The Golden Goose was protected, accommodated, and kept healthy at all costs. Mark Calloway was only 24 years old and had been in the WWF for barely a year when he received what should have been the defining opportunity of his early career. On November 27, 1991, at Survivor Series inside Joe Louis Arena in Detroit, he would challenge Hogan for the WWF Championship in the main event. The first time in Survivor Series history that a singles match headlined the show instead of the traditional elimination format, It was promoted as Hogan's greatest challenge yet, the supernatural, undefeated Deadman against Hulkamania itself, an unstoppable force against the most beloved character in company history, the kind of program that could define a career or end one. Calloway arrived at the arena around noon, which was standard for pay-per-view days. What was not standard was the fact that Hogan was already there. A man who routinely did not arrive until 4 or 5 in the afternoon was walking the halls when Calloway entered the building. That locker room. In that era, you notice things like that. And you remembered them.
So I remember getting there about noon, and Hogan was already there. And I'm walking down the
Red
hall.
flag number one.
Red flag number one, right?
Hulk Hogan pulled him aside into the shower area. Back in that era, the showers were where everything important got handled. Disputes, deals, warnings, grudges. If something serious needed to be said, it happened there. Once you stepped into that room, the conversation became real, and what Hogan told Mark Calloway was that he had a pre-existing neck injury. He admitted he was nervous about taking the tombstone piledriver.
Back in the day, you went into the shower, whether it was to fight, settle, whatever score, it always happened in the shower. So he's telling me, he goes, hey, I got this neck injury. He says, I'm really nervous about taking your finish. And I was like, Hulk, believe me. I said, I will protect you.
Mark Calloway gave his word. He told Hulk Hogan that during the finish, he would hold him so tightly that an injury would be impossible. The conversation ended, but the message did not. For the rest of the day, the same reminder kept coming back, over and over again. Every time Calloway passed Hogan in the hallway, Hogan repeated it. My neck. Remember my neck. Don't forget about the neck. It was not casual conversation anymore. By that point, it felt like reinforcement, a warning repeated so many times that it became impossible to ignore.
So, with that, we went on about our business. Every point during the day, I'd pass him in the hall or whatnot, I'd get the, remember about my neck, right? So that's all I got all day was my neck.
The match continued. Ric Flair, who had debuted in the WWF only a few months earlier, made his way to ringside and slid a steel chair into the ring. Paul Bearer created the distraction. Then Mark Calloway lifted Hulk Hogan into position and delivered the tombstone piledriver. The finish was executed exactly the way he had promised, holding Hogan as tightly and securely as humanly possible. The crowd erupted, Calloway's knees hit the mat, and before the referee could even complete the count, Hogan was already talking.
So we go into the finish. Flair comes down, slides the chair down. I pick him up, and when I tell you I had the brother secure, he was secure. Boom. I give him the tombstone. As soon as my knees hit, I hear, oh. You got me, brother.
My neck and my back.
And my neck. In the mind of the 24-year-old Mark Calloway, who had just become WWF champion for the first time in his career, everything collapsed at once. The opportunity he had been given. The promise he had made. The man he had just pinned. All of it caved in immediately. Shane McMahon stood beside Calloway behind the curtain, repeatedly telling him that Hogan's head had never come close to the mat. But the young Undertaker could not hear it. He could not process anything beyond the certainty that he had just destroyed his own future. 6 days later, at the Tuesday in Texas pay-per-view on December 3rd, 1991, Hulk Hogan won the title back in another finish involving Ric Flair, after Hogan threw funeral urn ashes into Undertaker's eyes. Soon after, the championship was vacated entirely and placed into contention for the 1992 Royal Rumble. The first world title reign of The Undertaker had lasted less than a week, when Calloway finally watched the footage back. Several wrestlers had already approached him beforehand, shaking their heads and confirming the same thing. Hogan's head never came close to the mat. Slowly, the shape of what had actually happened began to emerge, and when Calloway finally confronted Hogan directly in San Antonio, the explanation he received from the most powerful performer in the company became the sentence that ended whatever trust remained between them.
I got to San Antonio, and I was like, Terry, I watched it back. Your head never hit. He's like, well, brother, what it was you had me so tight that when we came down, I had nowhere to move.
I know what you're all about, and that's all I needed. Those words, spoken quietly in San Antonio decades before they were ever repeated on a podcast, became the entire thesis of the relationship, the early arrival, the shower conversation, the repeated reminders about the neck throughout the day, the scene on the floor of Vince McMahon's office, the requests for his wife and children. All of it came together into one clear picture. And that picture told Mark Calloway exactly who he was dealing with. Hulk Hogan later offered multiple, and sometimes contradictory, versions of the 1991 incident across interviews, books, television appearances, and legal depositions. In one version, his head hit the chair. In another, sweat caused him to slip. In others, the injury allegedly created long-term numbness in different parts of his body. The story shifted depending on the year and the audience. Wrestling journalist Dave Meltzer noted at the time that Hogan was hospitalized overnight following the event. But among many people who were there, and among those who later studied the footage, the consensus became that the injury had either been dramatically exaggerated or strategically amplified as leverage against a rising star. The Undertaker would not hold another world championship for more than 5 years after that night in Detroit. That was the practical consequence. But it did not break him. If anything, it sharpened him. When Hogan returned to WWE in 2002 as Hollywood Hogan, and the two worked a program together around the Undisputed Championship, Undertaker defeated him clean at Judgment Day 2002 to win the title, making him one of the very few wrestlers ever to beat Hogan cleanly for a world championship twice. By then, Calloway was no longer the nervous young talent hiding behind a wall listening to paramedics. He had become the unquestioned authority in the locker room, the conscience of the building. That transformation, from the devastated 24-year-old in Detroit to the respected locker room leader who eventually received a clean loss from the biggest star wrestling had ever produced, is the arc behind everything that followed, including what he said when news of Hogan's death broke on July 24, 2025. What The Undertaker revealed was not one explosive moment. It was something rarer. A career's worth of measured, clear-eyed honesty about one of the most complicated figures the wrestling industry has ever produced. And in the context of everything that followed Hogan's death. The family fractures, the legal disputes, the conflicting medical narratives, and the posthumous documentary. That kind of honesty turned out to be the rarest thing anyone offered. Hogan once said he knew where all the bodies were buried. The Undertaker, characteristically, never said anything that dramatic. He simply said what he believed was true. And after 34 years of consistently saying what was true, even about people he had every reason to reduce into simpler stories, that became the only revelation that truly held up. If you enjoyed this video, click the card on screen for more.